The morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked earth of what used to be Jake Martinez's farm, each ray of light illuminating another failure. The cornstalks stood brown and brittle, their husks rattling in the dry wind like the bones of forgotten dreams. Jake knelt beside his rusted pickup truck, his calloused hands trembling as he counted the crumpled bills one more time. $17.38. That was all that stood between him and complete ruin. The bank notice crumpled in his back pocket felt heavier than the mortgage it represented. Foreclosure proceedings would begin in 30 days. 30 days to find $47,000 or lose everything his grandfather had built with his bare hands in 1952. Jake's throat tightened as he remembered the old man's weathered face, the pride in his eyes when he'd walked these same fields, pointing out where the property lines ran, where the good soil lay, where a man could build something lasting. Lasting, Jake whispered to the empty fields, his voice bitter as drought dust. Right. If you're enjoying this story of Jake's incredible journey, please give it a like and share it with someone who loves tales of redemption. Your support means everything. 3 years of failed crops had stripped away more than just his savings. They'd taken his confidence, his marriage, his sense of purpose. Sarah had left 6 months ago, her suitcase packed with all the reasons why loving a failing farmer wasn't enough anymore. The house felt like a mausoleum now, every room echoing with memories of better times, when the fields were green and the future seemed as endless as the Nebraska sky. The memories came unbidden as Jake sat in the dust of his dying farm. He remembered the bay he'd proposed to Sarah, right here among the corn rows when they stood tall and proud, their silk catching the evening light like spun gold. She'd said yes with tears in her eyes, and they'd planned their life together in this place, children running between the rows, holiday dinners in the farmhouse his grandfather had built, a dynasty of Martinez farmers stretching into the future. Instead, there had only been disappointment. The first year after their marriage, the rains had come late, and half the crop had withered before the irrigation system could compensate. The second year brought too much rain, flooding that rotted the corn in the fields and left them with insurance money that barely covered the loan payments. By the third year, Jake had started drinking more than he should have, staying up late, staring at weather reports and market prices, trying to find some combination of factors that would explain why everything he touched seemed to die. Sarah had tried to be supportive at first. She'd taken a job in town to help with expenses, worked double shifts at the diner while Jake spent his savings on new equipment and different seed varieties, chasing the success that always seemed just one season away. But gradually her smiles had become forced, her patience worn thin by the constant stress of watching the man she loved destroy himself, trying to resurrect something that might already be dead. "You can't farm against the land, Jake," she'd said during one of their last real conversations, her voice heavy with exhaustion. "Your grandfather knew how to work with what he had. You're trying to force something that isn't there anymore." He'd been too proud to listen then, too stubborn to admit that maybe she was right. Now, sitting in the ruins of his dreams, her words echoed with the bitter clarity of hindsight. His grandfather had farmed during a different era when the weather patterns were more predictable, when the soil hadn't been depleted by decades of industrial agriculture, when a man could make a living on 160 acres without competing against corporations that farmed thousands. Jake's phone buzzed against his hip, the sound jarring in the morning stillness. He almost didn't answer it. Couldn't bear another call from the bank, another extension denied, another door slammed in his face. But something made him look at the screen. Unknown number. Local area code. A chill ran down Jake's spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. Someone had been watching them? His family? For how long? The thought of unknown eyes observing their struggles, documenting their failures, made his skin crawl. Had this Blackwood person been some kind of voyeur, taking pleasure in their misfortune? Or was there something more complex at work here? "What kind of property are we talking about?" Jake asked, though he barely dared to hope. "A ranch, Mr. Martinez. 1,200 acres in the Sandhills, about 40 miles northwest of your current location. The Broken Arrow Ranch. Mr. Blackwood owned it for over 30 years, but never lived there. According to the deed, it's been vacant since 1987. Jake's knees nearly buckled. 1,200 acres, free and clear. It sounded impossible, like something from a fever dream brought on by too much stress and too little sleep. In his current situation, even 100 acres would have seemed like salvation. 1,200 was beyond comprehension. "There must be a catch," he said. "Nobody just gives away 1,200 acres to a stranger." "There are conditions," Margaret Chen admitted, her voice taking on a more cautious tone. "Mr. Blackwood's will requires that you take personal possession of the property within 7 days of notification, and that you remain on the premises for a minimum of 1 year. During that time, you cannot sell, lease, or transfer any portion of the land. If you violate these terms, the property reverts to the state." Jake's mind raced. A year on an abandoned ranch, 40 miles from nowhere? It sounded like exile. But compared to losing his grandfather's farm to foreclosure, exile seemed like salvation. At least it would give him time to think, to plan, to figure out what came next without the constant pressure of impending financial doom. "There's one more thing," Margaret Chen continued. "Mr. Blackwood left specific instructions that you should be told about the ranch's unique characteristics before you make your decision. He wanted you to understand that the property has a history and that previous attempts to develop or modernize it have been unsuccessful." "What kind of unsuccessful?" Jake asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "The records are somewhat incomplete, but there have been 3 different families who attempted to establish working ranches on the property since 1950. All of them abandoned their efforts within a few years, citing unusual circumstances. Mr. Blackwood himself never explained what he meant by that phrase, but he was insistent that you be informed." Jake weighed his options quickly. Stay and face certain foreclosure, losing not just his land but his home and everything his family had built over 3 generations, or take a chance on an abandoned ranch with a mysterious history and at least buy himself a year to figure out what came next. When put in those terms, the choice seemed obvious. "I'll need to see this place." "Of course. I can meet you there this afternoon if you'd like. Say 2 o'clock. I'll bring all the necessary paperwork." After hanging up, Jake stood in the dying cornfield for a long time trying to process what had just happened. The rational part of his mind insisted this was some kind of scam, that lawyers didn't just call up broke farmers and hand them ranches. But desperation had a way of making the impossible seem merely improbable. He walked through the farmhouse one last time, each room holding memories that now felt like relics from someone else's life. The kitchen where Sarah had made coffee every morning, humming while she planned their day. The living room where they'd watched movies on winter evenings, her feet tucked under his legs on the old couch his grandfather had bought in 1975. The bedroom where they'd made love and made plans, and eventually just made excuses for why they couldn't seem to make anything work anymore. In the closet, he found the box of photographs Sarah had left behind, images of their early years together when everything seemed possible. Jake flipped through them slowly, studying the faces of 2 people who believed they could build a life together through sheer determination and love. They looked so young, so confident, so completely unprepared for the series of small disappointments that would eventually erode their foundation. There was one photograph in particular that stopped him cold. It showed him and Sarah standing in front of the farmhouse during their first spring as married couple, his arm around her waist and both of them grinning at the camera. Behind them, the field stretched green and promising to the horizon, and the expression on Jake's face was one of pure joy and anticipation. He looked like a man who believed he could do anything, conquer any challenge, weather any storm. Jake slipped the photograph into his wallet, then thought better of it and put it back in the box. That version of himself was gone, had died somewhere between the failed harvest and the final fight with Sarah. Carrying reminders of who he used to be would only make it harder to figure out who he needed to become. He spent the morning packing what little he owned into the back of his pickup. Clothes, tools, a few photographs, his grandfather's old Bible. Everything that mattered fit into 3 cardboard boxes and a duffel bag. As he loaded the last box, his neighbor, Pete Kowalski, wandered over, drawn by curiosity and probably hoping for gossip. "Moving out already?" Pete asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Thought you had till next month." "Something came up," Jake said, not ready to explain what he didn't understand himself. "Keep an eye on the place, will you?" Pete nodded, but his eyes were full of questions Jake couldn't answer. The two men had known each other for over 20 years, had helped each other through harvest seasons and equipment breakdowns, and the kinds of small crises that bound farming communities together. But Jake found he had nothing to say about what was happening to him, no way to explain a situation that made no sense even to himself. "You take care of yourself," Pete said, finally, extending his hand, "and don't be a stranger, you hear?" Jake shook his neighbor's hand, knowing it might be the last time they saw each other. Pete represented everything he was leaving behind, the community that had shaped him, the traditions that had defined his family for generations, the life that had failed him so completely he was willing to abandon it for the unknown. The drive northwest took him through a country he'd never seen before, despite living in Nebraska his whole life. The landscape gradually shifted from farmland to rangeland, from neat rectangular fields to rolling hills covered in prairie grass that stretched to the horizon like a green ocean. The further he drove, the fewer houses he saw, until it seemed he was traveling through a land forgotten by time itself. The GPS signal grew weaker as he drove deeper into the sandhills, and Jake found himself navigating by instinct and the occasional faded road sign. The silence was profound out here, broken only by the sound of wind through the grass and the occasional cry of a hawk circling high overhead. It was a different kind of emptiness than what he'd experienced on his failing farm. Not the emptiness of death and disappointment, but the emptiness of space waiting to be filled. When he finally reached the coordinates Margaret Chan had given him, Jake found himself staring at a gate that looked like something from another era. Wrought iron twisted into elaborate patterns, topped with letters that spelled Broken Arrow Ranch in script so ornate it was almost unreadable. The gate stood open, hanging slightly askew on hinges that screamed with rust. A black sedan sat parked beside the gate. Margaret Chen climbed out as Jake approached, a woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back severely and eyes that missed nothing. She wore a business suit that looked out of place in the vastness of the sandhills, but she moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to handling complex legal matters in unusual circumstances. "Mr. Martinez," she said, extending her hand, "thank you for coming so quickly." Her handshake was firm and professional, but she noticed she held eye contact longer than necessary, as if she were trying to read something in his expression. "I have to admit," she continued, "when Mr. Blackwood first described his plans for this property, I thought they were unconventional. But after 20 years of practicing law in rural Nebraska, I've learned that unconventional doesn't necessarily mean unreasonable." They walked through the gate together, following a dirt road that wound between low hills covered in buffalo grass and wildflowers. The silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through the grass and the occasional cry of a hawk circling high overhead.
It was a different kind of emptiness than what he'd experienced on his failing farm. Not the emptiness of death and disappointment, but the emptiness of space waiting to be filled. They crested a hill, and suddenly the ranch house came into view. Jake stopped walking, his breath catching in his throat. The house was massive, a sprawling structure of native stone and weathered timber that seemed to grow out of the landscape itself. It had the look of something built to last forever, though decades of neglect had left their mark. Windows were boarded up, the roof sagged in places, and weeds grew tall around the foundation.
But even in its decay, the house possessed a wild beauty that spoke to something deep in Jake's chest. This wasn't just a building, it was a statement, a declaration that someone had once believed in permanence, in putting down roots so deep that nothing could shake them loose. The architecture was unlike anything Jake had seen before, a mixture of styles that somehow worked together to create something uniquely suited to this landscape. "The house has been empty for 38 years, Margaret said, consulting her paperwork. "No electricity, no running water. The nearest neighbor is 15 miles away. Are you certain you want to do this?" Jake stared at the house, imagining what it must have looked like in its prime. He could almost see smoke rising from the chimney, lights glowing in the windows, the sound of laughter echoing across the prairie. For the first time in years, he felt something that might have been hope stirring in his chest. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I'm certain." The conviction in his own voice surprised him. Standing here in the shadow of this abandoned house, surrounded by more land than he'd ever dreamed of owning, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced since the early days of his marriage, a sense of possibility, of potential waiting to be unlocked. The house was broken, the land was neglected, but underneath the decay he could sense something solid and enduring, something that had survived decades of abandonment and was still waiting for the right person to restore it to life. They spent the next hour walking the property lines, at least what they could cover on foot. The ranch was enormous, encompassing not just the main house, but several outbuildings in various states of repair, a barn that leaned precariously but still stood, and most intriguingly, an old stone well house that sat in a grove of cottonwood trees about a quarter-mile from the main house. The outbuildings told their own story of the ranch's history. A machine shop with tools still hanging on the walls, covered in rust but recognizable. A grain storage building that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. A series of smaller structures that might have been bunkhouses or equipment sheds, their purposes lost to time and neglect. But it was the animals that surprised Jake most. Despite the ranch's apparent abandonment, it was far from lifeless. Cattle moved through the pastures, wild things that had clearly been fending for themselves for years, but healthy and well-adapted to the environment. Hawks and eagles circled overhead, and the grass itself was thick and rich, suggesting that the land had been healing itself during the long years of human absence. "What's the story with the well?" Jake asked as they approached the small stone structure. "I'm not sure," Margaret admitted. "Mr. Blackwood was very specific that it be included in the deed. It's mentioned separately from the water rights, which is unusual. He also left instructions that you should be careful around it, though he never explained what he meant by that." The well house was built of the same native stone as the main house, but it was much older, covered in lichen and half hidden by the spreading branches of the cottonwoods. A heavy wooden door hung slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness within. The air around the structure felt different somehow, cooler, more still, as if the grove existed in its own microclimate, separate from the surrounding prairie. Jake pushed the door open wider, and cool air flowed out, carrying with it the scent of deep earth and something else that made his skin prickle with inexplicable unease.
He couldn't see the bottom of the well, but he could hear water moving far below, a soft rushing sound that seemed almost like whispers. "We should head back," Margaret said, checking her watch. "I have other appointments this afternoon." As they walked back toward the main house, Jake found himself looking over his shoulder at the well house, drawn by something he couldn't name. There was a quality to the place that reminded him of churches he'd visited as a child, a sense of reverence, of something sacred that demanded respect, even if you didn't understand its nature. They returned to the main house, where Margaret spread the deed and other documents across the hood of her sedan. The paperwork was extensive and complex, filled with legal language that Jake barely understood, but the essential facts were straightforward. He was inheriting 1,200 acres of prime rangeland, free and clear, with no debts or encumbrances. The only conditions were those Margaret had already explained. He had to live on the property for a minimum of 1 year, and he couldn't sell or transfer any portion of it during that time. "There is one other thing," Margaret said as Jake signed the final documents. "Mr. Blackwood left a letter for you. He insisted that you should read it only after you had seen the property and decided to accept the inheritance." She handed him a sealed envelope, yellowed with age and bearing his name in careful handwriting. Jake turned it over in his hands, noting the weight of good paper and the old-fashioned fountain pen ink that had been used to address it. "He wrote this years ago?" Jake asked. "The letter is dated 1995, Margaret confirmed. "Mr. Blackwood revised his will several times over the years, but this letter remained unchanged. He seemed convinced that someday someone with your name would stand exactly where you're standing right now, making exactly the decision you've just made." Jake signed where she indicated, each signature feeling like a step into an unknown future. When it was done, Margaret handed him an ornate iron key that looked as old as the gate. "Congratulations, Mr. Martinez. You are now the owner of the Broken Arrow Ranch. Remember, you have 1 year and you must remain on the property. There's a landline telephone in the house. It should still be connected. If you need anything, don't hesitate to call." After Margaret drove away, Jake stood alone in front of his new home, key heavy in his hand. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant toward evening, painting the stone walls golden and casting long shadows across the overgrown yard. In the distance, he could hear cattle lowing, wild things that had made the abandoned ranch their own. He unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house smelled of dust and abandonment, but underneath those scents lay others: wood smoke, leather, something that might have been perfume from decades past. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that leaked through gaps in the boarded windows, and his footsteps echoed in rooms that had known silence for far too long. The interior of the house was even more impressive than its exterior had suggested. High ceilings with exposed beams, massive stone fireplaces that looked like they could heat entire wings of the house, hardwood floors that had been built to last centuries. This wasn't just a ranch house, it was a manor, designed by someone who had envisioned a dynasty that would endure for generations. As he explored the house, Jake began to understand the magnitude of what had fallen into his hands. Room after room revealed the remnants of a life interrupted: furniture covered in white sheets, books still on their shelves, photographs in silver frames turned face down, as if someone couldn't bear to look at them anymore. The kitchen was enormous, designed to feed a large family or crew of ranch hands. The bedrooms were spacious and well-appointed, with views that stretched for miles across the surrounding grassland. In what had once been the master bedroom, he found a journal lying open on a dust-covered desk. The pages were yellowed with age, but the handwriting was still legible. The last entry was dated September 15, 1987, written in a careful hand. "The dreams are getting stronger. Every night the same vision. The water calls and something answers from the deep. I cannot stay here anymore. Perhaps someday someone worthy will come. Someone who understands that some gifts come with a price, and some prices are worth paying. Jake read the entry 3 times, a cold certainty settling in his stomach. Cornelius Blackwood hadn't just left this place, he'd fled from it. But fled from what? The light was fading outside, and Jake realized he needed to make some practical decisions about his first night in the house. The electricity had been disconnected long ago, and he hadn't brought enough supplies for an extended stay. But something about the house itself made him reluctant to leave, even for a trip to town. It felt like the kind of place that might be different when you returned, as if absence could somehow alter its essential character. He made his bed in the front parlor, spreading his sleeping bag on the floor near the massive stone fireplace. The room was large enough to house a small apartment with built-in bookshelves that still held hundreds of volumes, and windows that, once unboarded, would provide panoramic views of the surrounding countryside. As darkness began to fall across the sandhills, Jake made a fire in the fireplace, using wood he found stacked beside the hearth. The flames danced and crackled, filling the room with warm light and the comforting smell of burning oak. For the first time in months, he felt something approaching peace. But peace, Jake was beginning to learn, was a complicated thing in this place. As the house settled around him in the cooling air, wood and stone contracting with soft groans and sighs that almost sounded like voices, Jake opened the letter Margaret Chen had given him. The paper was heavy and expensive, the kind used for important documents, and Cornelius Blackwood's handwriting was elegant in the old-fashioned way of someone who had learned penmanship when it was still considered an art. "Dear Mr. Martinez," the letter began. "If you are reading this, then you have accepted the inheritance I have left you, and you are spending your first night in the house that should have been your ancestral home. I know this will sound impossible, but I know that you belong here in ways that neither one of us fully understands. I am not your benefactor, Mr. Martinez. I am your great-great-great-grandfather. My name was once Thomas Blackwood, and I married your great-great-great-grandmother, Maria Herrera, in 1898. We built this house together, planned to fill it with children and laughter and the kind of love that could last for generations. But the influenza pandemic of 1918 took Maria and our 3 children, and I could not bear to live in a place that held so much sorrow. I changed my name to Cornelius and moved to Grand Island, telling myself I was starting fresh. But this place never left me. I felt it calling to me across the years, felt the weight of promises unfulfilled and responsibilities abandoned. I knew that someday someone from Maria's bloodline would have need of what I built here, and I wanted to make sure it would be waiting.
The ranch is not just a gift, Mr. Martinez. It is a restoration of family, of purpose, of connections that were broken but never truly severed. You carry Maria's blood, her strength, her ability to see beyond the surface of things to the deeper currents that move through life. This land recognizes that blood. It has been waiting for your return. But I must warn you, as I was never properly warned myself, this place is more than it appears. There are forces here older than European settlement, older than human memory. The Lakota who lived here before us knew this, respected it, worked with it rather than trying to control it. We must learn to do the same, or risk losing everything that matters. Pay attention to the water, Mr. Martinez. Pay attention to the dreams. And remember that some inheritances come with obligations that extend far beyond legal ownership. With hope for the future and sorrow for the past. Thomas Blackwood, who called himself Cornelius. Jake read the letter twice before setting it down with trembling hands. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the gaps in the boards that covered the windows. Everything Blackwood had written felt true in ways that defied rational explanation. resonating with something deep in Jake's bones that recognized this place as home, despite never having seen it before. The implications were staggering. If Blackwood was telling the truth, then Jake hadn't inherited the ranch from a stranger. He'd inherited it from his own family, reclaiming a birthright that had been lost for over a century. The house that felt so familiar, the land that called to something deep in his chest, the sense of belonging that had struck him the moment he'd seen the place, all of it made sense if this was where his family's story had begun. But Blackwood's warnings troubled him. Forces older than human memory, the water, the dreams. What had the old man encountered here that had frightened him enough to flee? And what obligations came with this inheritance that extended beyond simple property ownership? As if summoned by his thoughts, Jake began to hear something underneath the wind. A sound like water moving through stone, faint but persistent, seeming to come from the direction of the well house. He told himself it was just his imagination, just the power of suggestion working on a mind already disturbed by Blackwood's mysterious letter. But the sound continued, rhythmic and purposeful, like a heartbeat echoing through the earth itself. Jake closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but his dreams were full of rushing water and whispered words in languages he didn't recognize. In those dreams, he walked to the well house in the grove of cottonwoods, pulled open the heavy door, and looked down into depth that seemed to have no bottom at all. And from those depths, something looked back. The first week at Broken Arrow Ranch passed like a fever dream, punctuated by moments of crystalline clarity. Jake woke up each morning to the sound of wind howling across the prairie, a constant reminder that he was further from civilization than he'd ever been. The isolation pressed against him like a physical weight, making every small task feel monumental and every silence echo with the ghosts of his former life. But it was also liberation. For the first time in years, Jake woke up without the immediate pressure of financial crisis hanging over his head. He had a year, minimum, to figure out his next move. The ranch was his, free and clear, and while it came with mysterious warnings and strange sensations, it also came with more space and possibility than he'd ever imagined owning. He established routines to keep his sanity anchored. Coffee at sunrise, brewed on the camp stove he'd set up in what used to be the kitchen. A walk around the property to assess what needed immediate attention, and there was plenty. The house required extensive work to be truly livable, the outbuildings needed repair, and the fencing was in poor condition despite the thriving wildlife that had made the ranch their home. Evenings he spent reading by kerosene lamplight, the journal he'd found becoming his companion in the darkness. The entries painted a picture of a man slowly losing his grip on reality, though Jake couldn't decide if Blackwood had been driven mad by isolation or if something more sinister had taken root in his mind. The journal entries were revealing in ways that Blackwood's letter hadn't prepared him for. The earliest entries, dating back to 1975, were mundane accounts of ranch life, cattle prices, weather observations, minor repairs. The handwriting was confident, the observations practical and grounded. But as the years progressed, the tone shifted dramatically. March 3, 1982. The dreams are becoming more vivid. I see the ranch as it was 100 years ago when the Lakota still hunted these hills. There's a woman who comes to the well, always at twilight. She speaks, but I cannot understand her words. When I wake, my mouth tastes of copper and sage. June 12, 1983. Found 3 dead ravens arranged in a perfect circle around the well house this morning. No wounds, no signs of struggle. It's as if they simply decided to die there. The local veterinarian says it's probably just coincidence, but he wouldn't look me in the eye when he said it.
October 15th, 1984. The water in the well has changed color. It runs clear during the day, but at night it takes on a greenish tint that seems to glow from within. I've tested it 3 times,
Perfectly safe to drink, they say. But I won't touch it anymore. Something down there is alive, and it's been waiting longer than any of us can imagine. Jake found himself drawn to these entries despite the chill they sent down his spine. Each night, he'd read a few more pages by lamplight, trying to understand what had driven a successful businessman to abandon everything and flee into the night. The rational part of his mind insisted that Blackwood had simply been a lonely man whose imagination had run wild in the vast emptiness of the sandhills. But the deeper he read, the harder that explanation became to accept. The loneliness was undeniably real. Jake had grown up in a farming community where neighbors were always within shouting distance, where the rhythms of communal life provided structure and meaning. Here, the nearest house was 15 miles away, and he could go days without seeing another human being. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the wind and the occasional cry of wild animals in the distance. But there was something else, something that made the isolation feel different from mere solitude. Jake began to notice that he wasn't actually alone on the ranch. There were the wild cattle, of course, and an abundance of wildlife that seemed unusually unafraid of human presence. But beyond that, there was a sense of being observed, of invisible eyes watching his movements with patient interest. He found himself talking aloud just to hear a human voice, conducting long conversations with the reflection in the dusty mirrors, or addressing questions to the portraits of strangers that hung on the walls. The people in those photographs seemed familiar somehow, as if he'd seen their faces in dreams he couldn't quite remember. There was one woman in particular, captured in a silver frame on the mantelpiece, whose dark eyes seemed to follow him as he moved through the room. "Who were you?" he asked her photograph one evening, the sound of his voice startling in the quiet. "And why do I feel like I should know you?" The photograph naturally offered no answers, but that night Jake dreamed of her for the first time. In the dream, he stood in the well house at twilight, the door hanging open behind him. The woman from the photograph sat on the stone rim of the well, her long dark hair flowing like water over her shoulders. She wore clothing from another era, a simple dress of pale blue fabric that seemed to shimmer in the fading light. When she looked up at him, her eyes held depths that reminded him of the well itself, dark and mysterious and seemingly bottomless. "You came," she said, her voice carrying the soft accent of someone who'd grown up speaking a different language. "I've been waiting so long for someone who could hear the water's song." "I don't understand," Jake replied, though somehow, in the logic of dreams, he understood perfectly. "What song?" She smiled, an expression both sad and hopeful. "The song of what lies beneath, the story of what was lost and what might be found again. Your ancestor knew it once. The blood remembers, even when the mind forgets." "My ancestor?" Jake stepped closer, drawn by something he couldn't name. "I don't have any ancestors from around here. My family's from the eastern part of the state." "Martinez was not always your name," she said, rising gracefully from the well's edge. "Before the missions came, before the Spanish priests gave your people new identities, you were Crying Wolf's band. You were Lakota, and these hills knew your footsteps." The dream shifted, and suddenly Jake could see the ranch as it had been centuries ago. The house and outbuildings faded like morning mist, replaced by a landscape of rolling prairie dotted with buffalo and the occasional teepee. He saw himself, but not himself, a man who shared his face but wore buckskin and braided feathers in his hair. This other Jake knelt by the well, which was then just a natural spring surrounded by sacred stones, and cupped the water in his hands to drink. "The spring was holy to your people," the woman continued. "It connects this world to the world beneath, where the spirits of water dwell. When the soldiers came and the buffalo died, when your people were driven away, the spring's guardians went into hiding. But they never left. They waited, as water always waits, for the right person to return. Jake woke with the taste of copper and sage in his mouth, just as Blackwood had described. His heart hammered against his ribs, and for a moment he couldn't remember where he was. The dream had felt more real than his waking life, more vivid than any dream he'd ever experienced. He could still smell the woman's perfume, sage and wildflowers, and something earthy that reminded him of rain on summer soil. The next morning, he found himself drawn to the well house despite his unease. In daylight, it seemed less ominous, just an old stone structure that needed attention like everything else on the property. But as he approached the heavy wooden door, his steps slowed. The dream rushed back to him in waves. The woman's voice, her claims about his ancestry, the vision of the ranch as it had been before European settlers arrived. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The well itself was a circle of fitted stones, perfectly round and about 4 feet in diameter. A bucket hung from a rope that looked newer than everything else, though still weathered by time. Jake peered down into the depths, but the afternoon sun didn't penetrate far enough to reveal the bottom. The sound of moving water echoed up from below, that same soft rushing he'd noticed on his first day. Just a well, he told himself firmly, just water and stone and a lonely man's imagination.
But as he spoke, his voice seemed to be swallowed by the depths, and for just a moment, he could have sworn he heard an echo that sounded like laughter. The second week brought its own challenges. The isolation was starting to wear on him more severely, and he found his sleep plagued by increasingly vivid dreams. Sometimes he dreamed of the woman by the well, who told him stories of his supposed heritage that felt like memories rather than fantasies. Other times he dreamed of Cornelius Blackwood, a thin man with wild eyes who wandered the ranch at night, always moving toward the well house as if drawn by some invisible force. Jake's attempts to research his family history online yielded frustrating results. The internet connection at the ranch was spotty at best, dependent on a satellite dish that worked only when the weather cooperated. But in his brief periods of connectivity, he discovered that his knowledge of his own genealogy was less complete than he'd assumed. His grandfather had always said the Martinez name came from his great-grandfather, who'd married into the family sometime in the 1890s. Before that, the records grew murky. There were references to a family named Herrera, and before that, the trail went cold entirely. Jake found himself wondering if the woman in his dreams might be right, if his family's history contained chapters he'd never known existed. The thought should have been exciting, but instead it filled him with a deep unease. If his dreams were somehow tapping into genetic memory, into the experiences of ancestors he'd never known, then what else might be buried in the deep places of his mind? And why was this ranch, this well, the key that seemed to be unlocking those buried chambers? Physical work became his refuge from these troubling thoughts. He threw himself into repairing the ranch with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The barn's sagging roof became his first major project, a task that required him to tear away decades of rotting timber and replace it with new beams. The work was backbreaking, especially doing it alone, but it gave him something concrete to focus on, something that made sense in a world that seemed increasingly surreal. The barn itself told stories of its own past, carved initials in the support beams, some dating back to the early 1900s. Names like TB plus MH, 1898, surrounded by a heart, and beneath it, in a child's careful letters, Little Tom, 1915. The tragedy that had befallen the Blackwood family was written here in these simple carvings, evidence of a happiness that had been cut short by forces beyond human control. As he worked, Jake began to notice things that hadn't been apparent during his initial survey of the property.
Carved symbols on some of the fence posts, worn smooth by weather, but still visible if you knew how to look. Stone formations in the pastures that seemed too regular to be natural, as if they'd been placed by human hands for purposes he couldn't fathom. And everywhere, the sense of being watched by invisible eyes. The isolation played tricks on his mind. More than once, he was certain he saw figures moving in his peripheral vision, only to turn and find nothing but prairie grass swaying in the wind. Sounds that might have been voices carried on the wind, too, distorted by distance to make out words, but unmistakably human in their cadence. He began to understand why Blackwood had fled, why a man might abandon everything rather than face whatever lurked in the spaces between certainty and madness. But Jake had nowhere else to go. His old farm was gone, claimed by the bank and sold at auction to a corporate agricultural company that would strip mine the soil until nothing remained but dust. Sarah had made it clear that reconciliation was impossible. He'd received divorce papers in the mail 3 days after arriving at the ranch, her signature final and unforgiving. His few friends had grown tired of his struggles long before his final defeat, their sympathy exhausted by years of watching him fail at everything he touched. The Broken Arrow Ranch, with all its mysteries and terrors, was his last chance at building something meaningful with his life. If he couldn't make a go of it here, in this place that seemed to want him in ways he didn't understand, then perhaps he wasn't meant to succeed at anything. The realization should have been crushing, but instead it brought a strange kind of peace. For the first time in years, Jake felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be, even if he didn't understand why. The ranch needed him as much as he needed the ranch, two broken things that might be able to heal each other if given enough time and patience. On his 15th night at the ranch, the dreams changed again. This time, he found himself standing not by the well, but in the main house as it had been in its prime. The rooms were filled with warm light and the sounds of family life. Children's laughter, the clatter of dishes, conversations in multiple languages blending together like a choir. He moved through the house like a ghost, observing but not participating, watching scenes from lives that had ended decades before his birth. In the kitchen, he saw a woman who might have been the grandmother of the woman by the well, kneading bread with flour-dusted hands while humming a song that seemed hauntingly familiar. Her face was round and kind, with laugh lines around her eyes that spoke of a life filled with joy, despite the hardships that would have been common in that era. The kitchen itself was a marvel of organization and efficiency, designed by someone who understood the rhythms of feeding a large family and a crew of ranch hands. In the parlor, men sat around a table playing cards, their faces weathered by sun and wind, their conversation a mixture of Spanish and something else, something that might have been Lakota. They laughed easily with each other, these men from different cultures who had found common ground in the shared work of building something lasting on this harsh but beautiful land.
"This was home," said a voice behind him. Jake turned to see the woman from the well, but she was different now, younger, her dark hair penned up in the style of the early 1900s. She wore a simple dress of deep blue fabric, and her hands were marked by the kind of work that came from a life lived close to the land. "Whose home?" Jake asked, though part of him already knew the answer. "Yours," she said simply. "Your great-great-grandmother, Maria Herrera, married Thomas Blackwood in 1898. He built this house for her, for the life they planned to share. But the influenza pandemic of 1918 took her and their children. Thomas couldn't bear to live here after that. He sold the ranch to his cousin Cornelius and moved to Grand Island, changed his name, tried to forget everything he'd lost." The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. Cornelius Blackwood was my great-great-grandfather's cousin? "Thomas was Cornelius," she said gently. "He changed his first name as well as his last, tried to become someone else entirely.
but you cannot escape your true nature forever. When he died, the ranch came back to where it belonged, to Maria's blood, to the family that should have grown up within these walls. Jake woke with tears on his face, grieving for people he'd never met, for a life that had been stolen by disease and heartbreak a century before his birth. The dream's logic might have been questionable, but its emotional truth resonated in his bones. He understood now why the house felt familiar from the moment he'd seen it, why the woman's face in the photograph had seemed so recognizable. In some way, he couldn't fully comprehend, he had come home. But coming home, he realized, was only the beginning. The house was massive, built of native stone and weathered timber, though decades of neglect showed. As dawn broke over the sandhills, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Jake made a decision that surprised him with its certainty. He would stay. Not just for the year required by Blackwood's will, but for as long as it took to understand what he inherited along with the deed. The ranch had secrets, and those secrets were his by right of blood and by choice of will. But first, he needed to know what lay at the bottom of the well. The time for avoiding that confrontation had passed. Whatever waited in the depths, water spirit or genetic memory, madness or enlightenment, Jake was ready to face it. The morning air was cool against his skin as he walked through the tall grass toward the cottonwood grove, his footsteps sure and steady. Behind him, the house watched with windows that caught the early light like knowing eyes. Ahead, the well house waited in shadow, patient as water, ancient as the hills themselves. As he reached for the heavy wooden door, he felt the weight of generations pressing against his shoulders. He was no longer just a failed farmer seeking refuge from his mistakes. He was the inheritor of something much older and more complex, something that connected him to the land in ways he was only beginning to understand. The door swung open with a groan of protest, revealing the darkness within. But this time, Jake didn't hesitate. This time, he stepped across the threshold and into the mystery that had been waiting for him all his life. The bucket descended into darkness with a grinding whisper of rope against stone. Jake held his breath as he counted the seconds. 5, 10, 15, before he heard the distant splash that meant the bucket had found water. The sound echoed up from the depths like a voice calling from another world, and for a moment he wondered if he was making the same mistake that had driven Cornelius Blackwood to madness. But there was no turning back now. The dreams had become too vivid, the sense of connection too strong to ignore. Whatever secrets lay at the bottom of the well, they were his to discover. He began to pull the rope hand over hand, feeling the weight of the water-filled bucket growing heavier with each pull. When it finally emerged from the darkness, Jake's breath caught in his throat. The water glowed. Not the harsh electric glow of artificial light, but a soft, organic luminescence that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. As Jake watched, transfixed, the glow intensified and faded in a rhythm that matched his own pulse, as if the water were somehow alive, somehow aware of his presence. "Jesus," he whispered, setting the bucket down on the stone ledge with trembling hands. The water was clear as crystal, clearer than any well water he'd ever seen. But suspended within its depths were threads of light that moved like living things, weaving patterns that hurt his eyes to follow directly. When he looked at the water straight on, it appeared normal. But when he glimpsed it from the corner of his eye, the patterns became visible. Complex, geometric forms that seemed to shift between dimensions, existing in spaces that his mind couldn't quite comprehend. Jake dipped his finger into the water, half expecting it to burn or tingle with electricity. Instead, it felt like ordinary water, cool, clean, refreshing. But the moment his skin made contact with the surface, the patterns of light intensified, swirling around his finger like curious fish. Images flooded his mind.
He saw the ranch as it had been 200 years ago, when buffalo herds darkened the hills and the Lakota moved across the landscape like shadows of the wind. He saw the sacred spring that would later become the well, surrounded by offerings of feathers and carved stones, tended by medicine men who understood its power. He saw his own ancestors, not just Maria Herrera and Thomas Blackwood, but the generations before them, the Lakota families who had considered this place holy long before the first Europeans had set foot on the continent. The visions were more than just visual. They carried sounds, smells, emotions. Jake could hear the chanting of ceremonies performed around the spring, smell the sage smoke that had blessed the water for countless generations, feel the reverence and respect that had characterized the relationship between the people and this sacred place. But he also saw the disruption that came with European settlement. Not just the obvious violence of war and displacement, but the subtler damage of misunderstanding. The newcomers didn't recognize the spring's sacred nature, saw it simply as a convenient water source for their cattle and crops. They built over it, channeled it, treated it as a commodity rather than a living entity worthy of respect. The visions came faster now, overlapping and interweaving like the threads of light in the water. He saw the coming of the soldiers, the slaughter of the buffalo, the forced marches to reservations hundreds of miles away. He saw the sacred spring abandoned, its guardians dead or scattered, its songs forgotten by all but the water itself. And then he saw something else, something that made his blood run cold. In the depths of the spring, something vast and ancient stirred, not a creature in any sense he understood, but a presence that existed in the spaces between water and spirit, between memory and dream. It had been sleeping when the Lakota tended the spring, held in check by ceremonies and offerings and the careful balance between the human world and the world beneath. But when the people were driven away, when the old knowledge was lost, the presence had begun to wake. Jake jerked his hand back from the water, breaking the connection. The visions faded, leaving him gasping and disoriented in the dim confines of the well house. The bucket of water set innocently on the stone ledge, its glow barely visible in the afternoon light filtering through the doorway. For a long moment, Jake stood frozen, trying to process what he'd experienced. Part of him wanted to dismiss it as hallucination, as the product of too much isolation and too little sleep. But the images had been too vivid, too detailed, too consistent with the fragments of knowledge he'd pieced together from Blackwood's journal and his own dreams. The presence in the water was real, and it was stirring. That night, Jake didn't sleep at all. He sat in the parlor with every light in the house blazing, Blackwood's journal open on his lap, searching for clues about what he'd awakened. The later entries, the ones from Blackwood's final years on the ranch, painted a picture of mounting terror that now made horrifying sense. January 8, 1986. It spoke to me last night, not in words, but images that burned themselves into my mind. It showed me what this place was before the white man came, when the Indians kept it sleeping with their rituals and respect. But we disrupted all that. We built on sacred ground without understanding what we were disturbing. And now it's too late to undo what we've done. March 22, 1986. The water level in the well has been rising steadily for weeks. It should be impossible. There's been no rain, no snowmelt, nothing to account for the increase. But every day the water is higher than the day before. Sometimes I can hear it moving down there, like something huge turning over in its sleep. September 3, 1987. I've made my decision. I can't stay here any longer, can't continue to be the guardian of something I don't understand and can't control. But I can't simply abandon the responsibility either. Someone will have to come after me, someone with the right blood, the right connection to this place. I've written a new will, leaving everything to the Martinez family. They have Lakota blood, though they may not know it. Perhaps they can find a way to restore the balance that my family destroyed. Jake closed the journal with shaking hands. Blackwood hadn't fled in madness. He'd fled in terror, understanding exactly what he was leaving behind. And now Jake was the one who had to deal with the consequences of choices made generations before his birth. The next few days passed in a haze of mounting tension. Jake found himself drawn repeatedly to the well house, despite his fear of what he might find there.
Each time he looked into the water, the patterns of light were brighter, more active, more aware. And each time, the visions that came with contact were more intense, more demanding. He began to understand that the presence wasn't malevolent exactly, but it was incredibly powerful and utterly alien to human understanding. It had existed in the deep places of the earth since before the first humans had learned to make fire, and it was older than the continents themselves. The sacred spring had been its dwelling place for millennia, and the Lakota had understood the delicate balance required to keep it peaceful.
And Jake was the last guardian, the final link in a chain of responsibility that stretched back to the original inhabitants of the land. On his fourth night after touching the water, the presence made direct contact. Jake was lying in his makeshift bed in the parlor when he felt the familiar tingling sensation that preceded his dreams, but this time, instead of finding himself in the well house or wandering through visions of the past, he remained exactly where he was. The room around him didn't change, but suddenly he was no longer alone. The woman from his dreams materialized beside the fireplace, but she was different now, older, more solid, more real. Her dark eyes held depths that reminded him of the well itself, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of centuries. "You've touched the sacred water," she said, not accusingly, but with a kind of weary acceptance. "You've awakened what should have remained sleeping." "I didn't know," Jake said, sitting up in his sleeping bag. "I was just trying to understand what was happening to me." "Your blood called to it," she replied, moving closer. "The water recognizes you as one of the people, even though you've forgotten who you are. But recognition brings responsibility. The presence below has been patient for over 100 years, waiting for one of the bloodlines to return. Now that you're here, it expects you to fulfill the obligations your ancestors accepted." "What obligations?" Jake asked, though he was afraid he already knew the answer. "The spring must be tended. The old ceremonies must be performed. The balance between the world above and the world below must be maintained. Your ancestors understood this. They knew that some places are doorways between realms, and that those doorways must be guarded by those who understand their power." The woman gestured toward the windows, beyond which the night sky glittered with more stars than Jake had ever seen in his life. "This land remembers everything. Every prayer spoken over the sacred water, every offering made to ensure the presence remained at peace. When the people were driven away, when the old knowledge was lost, the land began to grieve. And that grief has been growing stronger with each passing year." "But I don't know the ceremonies," Jake protested. "I don't know anything about the old ways. I was raised Catholic, for Christ's sake. I don't even know if I really have Lakota blood, or if that's just something I dreamed." "The blood remembers what the mind has forgotten. And the presence is teacher as well as guardian. It will show you what you need to know if you're willing to learn." As if summoned by her words, Jake felt the presence stir in the depths below. Not malevolent, he realized, but incredibly powerful and utterly alien to human understanding. It was older than civilization, older than the species that had given birth to humanity itself. And it was reaching out to him, offering knowledge and power in exchange for service and respect. "What happens if I refuse?" Jake asked. The woman's expression grew sad. "Then it will rise from the depths and reclaim what was taken from it. The spring will burst forth from the earth with such force that it will wash away everything built on sacred ground. The house, the outbuildings, everything will be swept away, and the land will return to what it was before your people came. And if I accept, then you become what your ancestors were, a bridge between worlds, a guardian of the sacred places,
a keeper of the balance that allows both realms to exist in harmony. Jake closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him like a physical force. In the space of a few weeks, he'd gone from a failed farmer facing foreclosure to the inheritor of an ancient responsibility that stretched back to the beginning of time. It should have been overwhelming, should have driven him to flee as Blackwood had fled. But instead, he felt a strange sense of rightness, as if all the failures and disappointments of his life had been preparing him for this moment. The loss of his farm, the end of his marriage, the isolation and desperation that had brought him to the ranch, all of it had been necessary to strip away everything that wasn't essential, to prepare him for a role he never could have imagined. "How do I begin?" Jake asked. The woman smiled, and for the first time since he'd been seeing her in dreams, she looked truly happy. "With an offering," she said, "something from your heart, something that represents your willingness to serve. Place it in the sacred water at dawn, when the veil between worlds is thinnest. The presence will accept your gift and begin to teach you what you need to know."
When Jake woke the next morning, he was alone in the parlor, but the memory of the conversation was vivid and clear, and he knew exactly what offering he needed to make. In his pocket, he carried the last photograph of himself and Sarah, taken during happier times when their future together had seemed certain. It was the one memento of his old life that he'd been unable to let go of, the symbol of everything he'd lost and everything he'd failed to be. If he was going to embrace this new role, this ancient responsibility, he needed to release his hold on the past completely. The sun was just beginning to rise as Jake walked through the dewy grass toward the well house. The cottonwood trees whispered overhead, their leaves rustling with sounds that almost seemed like voices speaking in languages he didn't recognize. When he reached the heavy wooden door, he paused for a moment, gathering his courage. Then he stepped inside. The bucket still sat on the stone ledge where he'd left it, the water within glowing with that soft, organic light. But now Jake could see more than just the threads of luminescence dancing in the depths. He could see the presence itself, not as a physical form, but as a vast intelligence that existed in the spaces between water and light, between matter and spirit. It was beautiful and terrible at the same time, ancient beyond human comprehension, but possessed of a wisdom that made him feel like a child standing before a beloved grandfather. When it turned its attention to him, Jake felt a moment of overwhelming awe, as if he were in the presence of something holy. "I offer this," he said, pulling out the photograph, "as a symbol of my willingness to let go of what was and embrace what needs to be." He dropped the photograph into the water, watching as it sank slowly through the glowing liquid. As it descended, the image began to change. Sarah's face blurred and shifted, becoming the face of the woman from his dreams, then the faces of his ancestors, then faces he didn't recognize but somehow knew, the generations of guardians who had tended this sacred place before him. The presence stirred, and suddenly Jake's mind was flooded with knowledge. He saw the ceremonies that had once been performed at the spring, the careful placement of offerings, the songs that had been sung to keep the presence content, the rituals that had maintained the balance between worlds. He understood now that the spring was more than just a source of water. It was a nexus point where the physical and spiritual realms intersected, a place where the boundaries between dimensions grew thin. The presence had been a guardian of that intersection, ensuring that nothing dangerous passed between worlds. But it needed human partners to maintain the balance, people who understood both realms and could serve as intermediaries between them. The Lakota had fulfilled that role for centuries until they were driven away and the knowledge was lost. Now, Jake was being offered the chance to restore that partnership, to become the guardian the spring needed in the modern world. But the knowledge came with warnings as well as gifts. The power that flowed through the spring was vast and ancient, and it required careful handling. Used properly, it could heal and protect and create. Used carelessly, it could destroy everything within 100 miles.
The visions continued for what felt like hours, though when Jake finally emerged from the well house, the sun had moved only a few degrees across the sky. His head buzzed with new knowledge, his body thrummed with unfamiliar energy, and his heart felt lighter than it had in years. But his newfound understanding also brought sobering awareness of the challenges ahead. The presence had been patient for over a century, but its patience was not unlimited. If Jake failed to properly establish himself as the new guardian, if he couldn't master the ceremonies and rituals required to maintain the balance, the consequences would be catastrophic. Already the effects of the presence's awakening were becoming visible. The water level in the well had risen dramatically overnight, and Jake could hear the sound of rushing water growing stronger by the hour. In the distance, he noticed that several of the streams that crossed the property were running higher than they had since his arrival, as if the entire water table was being affected by whatever was happening in the depths below.
More disturbing were the changes in the local wildlife. Animals that should have been afraid of humans approached him with an almost tame curiosity. Birds gathered in unusually large flocks, their songs taking on complex harmonies that sounded almost like music. And at night, he could see lights moving in the distance. Not the harsh beams of human technology, but soft, organic glows that danced through the grass like earthbound stars. The presence was extending its influence beyond the confines of the well, reaching out into the surrounding landscape as it prepared to fully awaken. Jake realized that he had very little time to master his new role before the situation spiraled beyond his control. That afternoon, he began his first attempts at the ceremonies he'd seen in his visions. Using sage and sweetgrass he'd gathered from the prairie, he constructed small offering bundles and placed them at specific points around the spring. The movements felt awkward at first, his hands clumsy with unfamiliar gestures, but gradually muscle memory began to kick in. Not his own memories, but the inherited knowledge carried in his blood. The process was more complex than he had expected. Each offering had to be placed with specific intentions, accompanied by songs whose words came to him from some deep reservoir of ancestral memory. The sage had to be lit in a particular way, the smoke directed according to patterns that honored the 4 directions and the spirits that dwelt in each. Even the time of day mattered. Certain ceremonies could only be performed at dawn, others at twilight. Still others during the deep of night when the veil between worlds was thinnest. As he worked, he could feel the presence watching, evaluating his efforts with the patience of something that had existed since the world was young. When he made mistakes, subtle corrections would appear in his mind, guiding him toward the proper forms and intentions. When he succeeded, waves of approval would wash over him, filling him with a sense of rightness and purpose he'd never experienced before. But his efforts also attracted unwanted attention. On his 3rd night of ceremony, Jake became aware that he was being watched by more than just the presence in the well. As he knelt beside the spring, arranging offerings and speaking the words that came to him from some deep reservoir of inherited knowledge, he felt eyes upon him from the darkness beyond the cottonwood grove. At first, he thought it might be animals drawn by curiosity. But when he looked up from his work, he saw figures standing at the edge of the light, human shapes that wavered like heat shimmer, translucent and insubstantial, but unmistakably present. The spirits of the dead, he realized with a chill. The guardians who had come before him, drawn back to the sacred place by the stirring of ancient powers. Most of them seemed benevolent, watching his efforts with approval and encouragement, but others radiated hostility and suspicion. These, he understood, were the spirits of those who had died when the balance was broken, when the sacred spring was violated and its guardians scattered. They blamed him for the desecration, saw him as part of the same culture that had destroyed their world. The hostile spirits pressed closer, their anger washing over him like waves of ice-cold water, threatening to overwhelm his concentration and shatter his fragile connection to the presence below. But then the woman from his dreams appeared among the gathered spirits, her presence like a beacon of calm in the storm of conflicting emotions. She moved to stand beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder, in a gesture of support and protection.
"You are not alone," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite the chaos around them. "You carry the hopes and prayers of all who came before. Their knowledge flows in your veins. Their strength supports your efforts. Trust in the blood that connects you to this place, and let the spirits guide your hands."
The hostile spirits gradually withdrew, their anger cooling in the face of her authority. Jake realized that she was more than just the guardian of his dreams. She was the spirit of Maria Herrera, his great-great-grandmother, the woman who had lived in the house before tragedy scattered the family to the winds. She had been a bridge between cultures, even in life, and in death she continued to serve as a mediator between the living and the dead. With her guidance, Jake completed his first successful ceremony. As the last offering was placed and the final words spoken, he felt the presence in the depths settle into a more peaceful state. The water stopped rising, the supernatural lights in the distance dimmed to a gentle glow, and the oppressive sense of impending catastrophe lifted slightly. But Jake knew this was only the beginning. The presence was content for now, reassured by his efforts and commitment. But maintaining the balance would require constant vigilance, continuous ceremony, and a level of spiritual discipline he was only beginning to understand. As dawn broke over the sandhills, Jake sat by the sacred spring and contemplated the magnitude of what he'd taken on. He thought he was just inheriting a ranch, a place to rebuild his life after losing everything he'd once considered important. Instead, he'd inherited a responsibility that stretched back to the beginning of time itself, a role that would define not just his future, but the future of everyone who lived in the shadow of the sacred spring. The days that followed established a new rhythm in Jake's life. Each morning began with the dawn ceremony, a complex ritual of offerings and songs that ensured the presence remained calm through the day. Afternoons were spent in practical work, repairing the ranch buildings, tending to the wild cattle that had made the property their home, and learning to live off the land in ways that honored its sacred nature. Evenings brought the twilight ceremonies, more complex rituals that strengthened the barriers between worlds and ensured that nothing dangerous passed through the dimensional gateway that existed at the spring. And deep into the night, Jake would commune directly with the presence, learning from its vast store of knowledge and gradually understanding his role as guardian of forces beyond human comprehension. The isolation that had once tormented him became a necessary solitude. The nearest town was 40 miles away, but Jake found that he rarely needed to make the journey. The land provided everything he required: wild game that seemed to offer itself for his sustenance, plants whose medicinal properties he somehow knew without ever having studied them, and a sense of connection to something larger than himself that filled the emptiness he'd carried for years. But he wasn't entirely alone. Maria's spirit had become a constant companion, appearing whenever he needed guidance or reassurance. She taught him the old songs that had once kept the sacred spring peaceful, showed him how to read the signs that warned of imbalance, and gradually revealed the full scope of what it meant to be a guardian of the ancient ways. This knowledge was nearly lost. When my people were driven away, when the old ceremonies were forbidden, the springs fell silent, one by one. This place survived only because Cornelius never quite forgot what he had witnessed here. His guilt and fear kept him away, but they also kept him connected. Jake was learning to see the ranch through different eyes. What had once appeared to be random stone formations revealed themselves as carefully constructed prayer circles. Fence posts that seemed arbitrarily placed actually marked the boundaries of sacred ground. Even the wild cattle followed ancient paths that had been traveled by buffalo for millennia, their movements guided by instincts that remembered when this land had been a gathering place for spiritual ceremonies. The restoration work took on new meaning as Jake began to understand the ranch's true purpose. Every repair he made to the buildings, every fence he mended, every improvement to the land was part of a larger effort to create a space where the sacred could once again flourish. The house became not just his shelter, but a temple where ancient and modern ways could coexist.
But the most challenging aspect of his new role was learning to manage the presence itself. The entity in the depths was not malevolent, but it was utterly alien to human understanding. Its thoughts moved on scales of time that measured centuries like moments, and its awareness encompassed dimensions that human minds could barely glimpse. Through its awareness, Jake caught fleeting glimpses of these parallel realms, places where the laws of physics operated differently, where consciousness and matter interacted in ways that human science had never imagined. 3 months into his guardianship, Jake began to notice changes that extended far beyond the boundaries of the ranch. The restoration of the sacred spring was having effects that rippled outward through invisible channels, awakening dormant sites and stirring sleeping guardians across the region. The first sign came in the form of unusual weather patterns. Rain that had been scarce for years began falling regularly, but only in specific areas, zones that seemed to radiate outward from ancient sacred sites. Drought-stricken farms suddenly found their wells flowing again, while corporate agricultural operations that had strip-mined the soil continued to struggle with failed crops and depleted aquifers. Jake's nearest neighbor, a rancher named Tom Weathers, drove out to the Broken Arrow one morning with questions that Jake wasn't sure how to answer. "Something's happening to the land around here," Tom said, his weathered face creased with confusion. "My wells have been dry for 3 years, but yesterday they started flowing again. And it's not just me. Everyone in a 20-mile radius is reporting the same thing. The county extension agent can't explain it." Jake could have told him about the sacred spring, about the ancient presence that was slowly awakening and extending its influence through underground water systems. But he learned from Maria's spirit that such knowledge had to be shared carefully, with people who were prepared to understand and respect it. "Sometimes the land heals itself," Jake said instead, which was true enough. "Maybe we've just been working with it instead of against it." Tom nodded, but his eyes remained puzzled. "That's what I don't understand. My land looks the same as it always has, but the grass is greener, the cattle are healthier, and I haven't lost a single head to disease since this started. It's like something's protecting them." As Tom drove away, Jake realized that the presence's influence was creating a zone of enhanced fertility and protection around the sacred spring. Animals within its sphere of influence were healthier, plants grew more vigorously, and the land itself seemed to radiate a vitality that hadn't been seen in the region for over a century. But the changes weren't limited to environmental factors. People who lived within the expanding zone of influence reported unusual experiences, vivid dreams that seemed to carry important messages, increased intuitive abilities, and a growing sense of connection to the natural world. Some were frightened by these changes, but others embraced them with the recognition that they were experiencing something profound and transformative. It was during his 4th month at the ranch that Jake received his first visitor who truly understood what was happening. She arrived on foot, walking across the prairie like a figure from another century. Elena Crow Dog was a woman in her 30s with the bearing of someone who had been raised in traditional ways but educated in modern ones. She wore jeans and hiking boots, but her long black hair was braided with feathers and beads that marked her as someone who honored the old customs. "You're the new guardian," she said when Jake met her at the gate. It wasn't a question. "I'm Jake Martinez," though something about her presence made me feel like his name was less important than his role. "I'm Elena Crow Dog from the Pine Ridge Reservation. We've been feeling the awakening for weeks now. Ripples through the spiritual dimensions that told us someone had finally restored one of the old sites. My grandmother sent me to meet you, to offer our help if you need it." Elena's arrival marked the beginning of a new phase in Jake's education. She brought with her knowledge that had been preserved in oral traditions for generations, ceremonies and songs that complemented what he'd learned from direct communion with the presence. More importantly, she brought news of other sacred sites that were beginning to stir in response to the Broken Arrow's restoration. The network is awakening, she explained as they sat by the well house that evening. For centuries, these sites were connected, springs and stone circles and burial grounds that formed a web of spiritual energy across the entire continent. When your people, she paused, then smiled, when our people were driven away, the network went dormant. But it was designed to be self-healing. Restore one node, and it begins to awaken the others. Through Elena, Jake learned that he was part of something much larger than he had imagined. Across the Great Plains, dormant sacred sites were beginning to show signs of renewed activity. Springs that had been dry for decades were flowing again. Stone circles that had been forgotten were beginning to emit the soft glow that marked active spiritual sites. And people with the right bloodlines were experiencing dreams that called them to take up the role of guardian.
"My cousin David has been having dreams about the site near Wounded Knee," Elena told him. "And there's a rancher in Colorado who's been calling the tribal council, asking about strange lights on his property and water that glows in the dark. The awakening is spreading faster than anyone expected." But with the spreading awakening came new challenges. Not everyone welcomed the return of the old ways, and some of the sleeping sites were more dangerous than others. Elena spoke of places where the spiritual forces had been corrupted by violence and trauma, sites that would require careful cleansing before they could be safely restored. "There's a place in Oklahoma where a massacre occurred in 1864, she said, her voice heavy with sorrow. "The spirits there are angry, twisted by the violence that happened on sacred ground. If that site awakens before it's properly cleansed, it could spread that corruption through the network." Jake felt the weight of responsibility settling even more heavily on his shoulders. His restoration of the broken arrow had set in motion a process that could either heal the continent's spiritual wounds or spread those wounds like an infection through the ancient network of sacred sites. "What do we do?" he asked. "We work together," Elena replied. "The old knowledge was never meant to be held by individuals alone. Each guardian was part of a community, supported by others who understood the work. That's what we need to rebuild, not just the sites themselves, but the network of people who can tend them properly." Over the following weeks, Elena helped Jake refine his techniques and deepen his understanding of the guardian's role. She taught him songs that had been passed down through generations of her family, showed him how to read the subtle signs that indicated the health of a sacred site, and gradually introduced him to the broader community of people who were working to restore the ancient network. Through Elena's contacts, Jake began corresponding with other awakening guardians across the region. There was David Crowdog at the Wounded Knee site, working to heal centuries of accumulated trauma. Maria Santos in New Mexico, who was restoring a spring that had been sacred to the Pueblo peoples. Thomas Begay in Arizona, whose family had secretly maintained ceremonies at a Navajo sacred site throughout the years of suppression. Each guardian faced unique challenges based on the history and character of their site, but all were working toward the same goal: the restoration of a continental network of spiritual consciousness that could help guide humanity through the challenges of the modern world. "The Earth is sick," Elena explained during one of their evening conversations, "not just environmentally, but spiritually. The disconnection between human consciousness and natural systems has created imbalances that threaten all life on the planet. The network was designed to heal those imbalances, to create zones where the relationship between spirit and matter could be restored to proper harmony." As summer turned to autumn, Jake began to see the full scope of what was being accomplished. The zone of influence around the Broken Arrow Ranch continued to expand, creating an oasis of environmental health in a region that had been struggling with drought and ecological degradation. But more importantly, people within the zone were changing, becoming more intuitive, more connected to natural cycles, and more aware of their place in the larger web of life. Children seemed especially sensitive to the changes.
Those who lived within the influence of restored sites displayed unusual abilities, an uncanny knowledge of plant and animal behavior, an ability to predict weather changes days in advance, and a natural affinity for the ceremonial practices that maintained the sacred sites. They're the first generation to grow up with the network partially restored, Maria's spirit explained to Jake one evening. Their consciousness is developing in partnership with the awakened sites. They represent what human awareness might become if we can complete the restoration. But the work was far from complete, and new challenges arose with each passing day. Government agencies were beginning to take notice of the unusual phenomena occurring around restored sites, and some were treating them as potential threats to national security. Corporate interests that profited from environmental exploitation were mobilizing legal and political resources to challenge the water rights and land ownership of sacred sites. Jake received his first legal challenge in October when a petroleum company claimed mineral rights to the subsurface beneath the Broken Arrow Ranch. The case was obviously frivolous. The mineral rights had been clearly excluded from every deed transfer since the ranch's founding, but it represented the beginning of a coordinated effort to disrupt the network's restoration. "They don't understand what they're fighting," Elena said when Jake told her about the lawsuit. "They think this is about money, about controlling resources. They don't realize that what we're restoring could save their children's lives." Through his communion with the presence, Jake learned that the attacks on the sacred sites were being coordinated by forces that operated beyond the level of ordinary human consciousness. Just as there was a network of light working to restore spiritual balance to the earth, there were darker networks working to maintain the destructive patterns that had brought the planet to the brink of ecological collapse. "The battle isn't just happening in courtrooms and boardrooms," Maria's spirit warned him. "There are entities that feed on disconnection and destruction, and they see the awakening network as a threat to their influence. You must be prepared for challenges that go beyond anything the legal system can address." As if to confirm her warning, Jake began experiencing what could only be described as psychic attacks. Dark dreams filled with images of environmental devastation and spiritual corruption. Moments of sudden, overwhelming despair that seemed to come from outside his own consciousness. Equipment failures and accidents that defied probability, as if invisible forces were trying to disrupt his work.
But for every attack, there was also support. The network of awakened guardians was growing stronger, and they were learning to work together in ways that amplified their individual abilities. When Jake was under spiritual assault, he could call on the strength of guardians hundreds of miles away. When other sites faced challenges, the presence beneath the Broken Arrow would lend its ancient power to their defense. Winter brought a different kind of testing to the ranch. The presence beneath the sacred spring entered a period of deeper communion, its awareness turning inward as it prepared for the intensive work of spring. Jake found his dreams filled with visions of the Earth's deep history, ice ages and volcanic epochs, the rise and fall of ancient civilizations, the slow evolution of consciousness itself across geological time. During these winter months, Jake's role shifted from active guardian to student of the deepest mysteries. The presence shared knowledge that human beings had never possessed, insights into the relationship between consciousness and matter that could revolutionize human understanding of reality itself. He learned that what people called matter and energy were simply different expressions of consciousness at various levels of organization. The atoms that made up his body, the water in the sacred spring, the rock beneath his feet, all were forms of awareness expressing themselves according to the cosmic laws that governed the universe. This knowledge was known to your ancestors, Maria's spirit told him during one of their evening conversations. Before the separation between spirit and matter became so complete, humans understood that consciousness was the fundamental ground of all existence.
The sacred sites were places where this knowledge was kept alive, where the artificial barriers between inner and outer reality could be dissolved. But the knowledge came with sobering warnings about humanity's current trajectory. The disconnection from natural consciousness had reached critical levels, creating imbalances that threatened not just environmental collapse, but the breakdown of the fundamental systems that supported life itself. Your species stands at a crossroads, the presence communicated during one of their deep communions. The path of separation and exploitation leads to extinction within decades. The path of reunion and cooperation leads to a transformation that could establish human consciousness as a positive force in cosmic evolution. The choice must be made soon. As winter deepened, Jake began to understand that his role as guardian of a single site was preparing him for something much larger. The restoration of the continental network was only the first step in a process that could ultimately reconnect human consciousness with the cosmic intelligence that guided the universe itself. The isolation of winter also gave him time to work on practical preparations for the year ahead. The ranch buildings were fully restored now, transformed from ruins into a complex that could serve as a training center for new guardians. The land itself had been healed, its natural fertility restored through careful attention to the spiritual forces that supported all life. But perhaps most importantly, Jake had been transformed. The desperate, broken man who had arrived at the ranch a year ago was gone, replaced by someone who understood his place in the cosmic order and was ready to serve something infinitely larger than his individual concerns. Spring's arrival brought Elena Crowdog back to the ranch, this time accompanied by a delegation of tribal elders and spiritual leaders from across the region. They came to witness what Jake had accomplished and to formally recognize his role as guardian of one of the most important nodes in the awakening network. "You have done something that 3 generations of my people believed impossible," said Rose Crowdog, Elena's grandmother and a keeper of the old traditions. "You have awakened a sacred site that had been silent for over a century, and you have done it in a way that honors both the ancient wisdom and the needs of the modern world." The ceremony that followed was unlike anything Jake had experienced. Representatives from dozens of tribes gathered around the sacred spring, their voices joining in songs that had been sung in this place for thousands of years. The presence beneath the water responded with manifestations of power that left even the most experienced spiritual leaders awed and humbled. But the ceremony was more than just a celebration. It was a formal recognition that the network restoration had reached a critical threshold. With enough sites awakened and properly tended, the process would become self-sustaining. New sites would begin awakening spontaneously, guided by the intelligence that flowed through the restored network. "The work enters a new phase now," Rose told Jake as the ceremony concluded. "You are no longer just the guardian of a single site. You are a teacher, a bridge builder, a keeper of knowledge that must be shared with others who are ready to receive it."
By the end of his first year at the Broken Arrow Ranch, Jake had become something he never could have imagined. A teacher and mentor for a growing movement of people who understood that the future of human civilization depended on restoring the spiritual connections that had been severed by centuries of mechanistic thinking. The ranch had been transformed into a training center where people came to learn the arts of spiritual ecology. Scientists seeking to understand the relationship between consciousness and environmental health. Indigenous activists working to restore sacred sites on their own lands. Environmental lawyers fighting corporate attempts to exploit sacred ground. Young people who felt called to a life of service but didn't know how to express that calling in the modern world. Jake's daily routine now included teaching responsibilities that challenged him to articulate knowledge that had come to him through direct spiritual transmission.
How do you explain to a PhD in hydrogeology that water is conscious? How do you teach a lawyer to perceive the spiritual dimensions of land ownership? How do you prepare a young idealist for the profound responsibilities that come with becoming a guardian of sacred sites? The answer, Jake discovered, lay in creating experiences that allowed people to discover these truths for themselves. Carefully guided contact with the sacred water, participation in the daily ceremonies that maintained the site's balance, and gradual introduction to the expanded awareness that came with serving something larger than individual concerns. Not everyone who came to the ranch was ready for such experiences. Some visitors left convinced that Jake and his associates were either deluded or fraudulent. But those who stayed, who opened themselves to possibilities beyond their previous understanding, often underwent transformations that prepared them to become teachers and guardians themselves. Dr. Sarah Whitehorse, a hydrologist from the State University, arrived as a skeptic and left as one of the most effective advocates for the new understanding of water consciousness. Michael Running Bear, a veteran struggling with PTSD, found healing in the sacred waters that no conventional therapy had been able to provide, then stayed to become one of Jake's most skilled assistants in working with other trauma survivors. Margaret Chen, the lawyer who had first informed Jake of his inheritance, evolved from legal counsel to researcher, documenting the expanding network of sacred sites and developing legal strategies to protect them from exploitation. Her work would prove crucial as corporate and government opposition to the network intensified. But it was the children who most clearly demonstrated the potential of the awakening consciousness. Young people who spent time at the ranch often displayed abilities that amazed their parents and teachers: an intuitive understanding of ecological relationships, an ability to communicate with animals, and a natural gift for the ceremonial practices that maintain spiritual balance. "They're the bridge generation," Elena observed during one of her visits to the ranch. "The first humans in centuries to grow up with full access to the network consciousness. They'll be the ones to complete what we've started." As Jake's second year at the ranch began, he realized that his personal transformation was complete. He had become a catalyst for changes that could affect the entire planet. But more than that, he had found the sense of purpose and belonging that had eluded him throughout his previous life. Standing on the ridge where he'd first surveyed his inheritance, Jake marveled at the view before him. The land that had once seemed empty and desolate now teemed with life. The house that had been a ruin was now a center of learning and healing. The well that had once frightened him with its mysterious properties had become the source of wisdom that guided his every day. But perhaps most remarkably, Jake himself had been transformed from someone who felt disconnected from everything meaningful into someone who understood his place in the cosmic order. The sacred spring had not just given him a home, it had given him a destiny. The water glowed in the depths below, its ancient consciousness patient and wise, carrying messages of hope and renewal to every corner of a continent that was slowly remembering how to be whole. The network sang with the voices of awakened sites across the land, their harmonies weaving together into a symphony of consciousness that reached beyond Earth itself to touch the awareness of civilizations scattered across the cosmos. And at the center of it all, the work would continue. The network would expand, and the waters would forever sing songs of renewal and hope for any who had the wisdom to listen. The Broken Arrow Ranch was no longer broken. Jake Martinez was no longer lost, and the sacred spring sang with a voice that would echo through eternity, calling all who heard it home to the source from which they came and to which they would inevitably return. 5 years had passed since Jake Martinez first set foot on the Broken Arrow Ranch as a desperate man fleeing the wreckage of his former life.
Now standing in the same spot where he'd once counted his last $17, he watched as a delegation from the United Nations stepped out of a convoy of vehicles that seemed almost absurdly modern against the timeless backdrop of the restored prairie.
The presence would welcome such an expansion, Jake replied. Satellite data showed an expanding circle of restored grassland that now encompassed over 10,000 square miles, supporting wildlife populations that hadn't been seen in the region for over a century. But the delegates would soon learn that what they were observing was far more than just an environmental success story. The network of awakened sacred sites had grown to encompass over 200 locations across North America, with new sites awakening every month as trained guardians carried the techniques they'd learned to their own communities. The effects were becoming visible on a global scale. Regions influenced by the awakened sites were experiencing unusual weather stability, with droughts ending and flood patterns moderating in ways that climate scientists couldn't explain through conventional models. Agricultural yields in these areas were increasing dramatically, even as farmers reduced their use of chemical fertilizers and pesticides. Most remarkably, mental health statistics in the influenced regions showed consistent improvements that had public health officials scrambling to understand the correlation. Depression and anxiety rates were dropping, creativity indices were rising, and people reported a growing sense of connection to something larger than themselves. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the lead environmental scientist for the UN delegation, approached Jake with the mixture of skepticism and wonder that he'd grown accustomed to seeing in academics who studied the restored sites. "Mr. Martinez," she said, extending her hand, "I have to admit I'm struggling to understand how this level of restoration is possible in such a short time frame. What exactly are you doing here?" Jake smiled, recognizing the same hunger for understanding that had driven him to touch the sacred water that first time. "We're not doing anything that hasn't been done before. We're just remembering how to work with the land instead of against it." As he led Dr. Vasquez and her colleagues toward the well house, Jake felt the familiar stirring of the presence below. Over the years, his communion with the ancient consciousness had deepened to the point where they existed in constant communication, their awareness intertwined in ways that made him feel less like an individual guardian and more like a living extension of the network itself. "Before you see the water," Jake said, pausing at the heavy wooden door of the well house, "I need you to understand that this isn't just an environmental restoration project. This is a sacred site, one that has been tended by spiritual guardians for thousands of years. What you're about to witness has as much to do with consciousness as it does with chemistry." Dr. Vasquez nodded, though Jake could see the skepticism in her eyes. Like most scientists, she had been trained to distrust anything that couldn't be measured and replicated in laboratory conditions. But her skepticism would soon give way to wonder, as it had for countless other visitors who approached the spring with open minds. Jake opened the door, revealing the interior of the well house. The ancient stone well occupied the center of the circular chamber, its perfectly fitted stones rising from depths that seemed to extend beyond the reach of any earthly measurement. Around the walls, niches held offerings from pilgrims who had come seeking healing or guidance. Feathers and crystals, photographs of loved ones, handwritten prayers in dozens of languages. But it was the water itself that captured Dr. Vasquez's attention. Even in the dim light filtering through the chamber's small windows, she could see the soft luminescence that emanated from the depths, the patterns of light that moved through the water like living thoughts. "My God," she whispered, approaching the well's edge with the reverence of someone who understood she was in the presence of something unprecedented. "It's actually glowing. How is that possible?" Jake offered her a ceremonial cup filled with the sacred water. "If you're willing to approach this with an open mind, you can experience what I'm talking about directly." The moment the water touched her lips, Dr. Vasquez's awareness expanded in ways she never could have imagined. She felt her consciousness stretching beyond the boundaries of her individual identity, connecting with a vast network of awareness that included not just the spring, but every drop of water in the global hydrological cycle. When the experience faded and her normal awareness returned, Dr. Vasquez found herself weeping, not from sadness, but from a kind of overwhelming joy that came from understanding for the first time in her life that she was part of something infinitely larger and more beautiful than she had ever imagined.
"This changes everything," she whispered, her voice trembling with the magnitude of what she had experienced. "If consciousness is actually embedded in the natural world itself, then everything we think we know about the relationship between mind and matter needs to be reconsidered."
Over the next several days, Dr. Vasquez and her colleagues experienced a crash course in the kind of expanded awareness that Jake had been cultivating for years. They participated in the dawn ceremonies that Jake performed each morning, witnessed the evening communions that maintained his connection to the presence below, and gradually began to understand that they were documenting something far more significant than an unusual environmental recovery. As the delegation prepared to leave, Dr. Vasquez approached Jake with a request that would reshape the trajectory of the restoration movement. "We want to propose establishing an international research consortium to study these sites," she said, "but not the kind of study that treats them as objects to be analyzed and exploited. We want to learn how to replicate what you've accomplished here, how to awaken dormant sites in other parts of the world." Jake felt a surge of excitement at the possibility. The presence below had shown him visions of a global network of consciousness that could help guide humanity through the challenges of the coming centuries. Sites in Africa that remembered the wisdom of the ancestors, springs in Asia that held the accumulated meditation of thousands of generations, sacred waters in Europe that carried the dreams of druids and mystics, all of them waiting to be awakened and reconnected to the expanding web of awareness. "The presence would welcome such an expansion," Jake replied, "but it would have to be done with proper respect and understanding. These sites can't be awakened through technology or force. They respond only to consciousness that approaches them with reverence and genuine spiritual preparation." As the delegation's vehicles disappeared into the distance, Jake felt a profound sense of completion. The work that had begun with his desperate flight from a failed farm had grown into something that might represent humanity's best hope for long-term survival and flourishing. That evening, as he performed his nightly communion with the sacred spring, Jake reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The broken farmer who had inherited an abandoned ranch had become the catalyst for a global transformation that was just beginning to unfold. The presence stirred in the depths below, its ancient consciousness touching his awareness with the warmth of deep affection. Through their communion, Jake understood that his individual role in the great work was approaching a transition. The network was now strong enough to guide its own expansion. The techniques for awakening sites had been documented and taught to hundreds of capable guardians, and the next phase of the work would require different skills and different leaders. "You have planted the seeds," the presence communicated. "Now others will tend the garden you have created. Your legacy will grow long after your individual awareness has returned to the source from which it came." Jake felt no sadness at this recognition. He had accomplished something that would outlast any individual lifetime, had participated in the restoration of humanity's relationship with the living earth in ways that would influence the development of consciousness for generations to come. The song they sang was ancient beyond human memory, a melody that had been carried in the waters of the earth since the first rains fell on barren stone. But it was also completely contemporary, expressing hopes and dreams for a future in which humanity had learned to live in partnership with the forces that sustain all life. In the depths of the well, ancient waters glowed with the light of possibilities that stretched beyond imagination, while overhead the stars wheeled in their eternal courses, witnessing the slow emergence of a new chapter in the relationship between consciousness and cosmos. The transformation was complete, but the work would never end. And that, Jake understood with perfect clarity, was exactly as it should be. Jake looked at the letter from Sarah's lawyer, the divorce papers he'd never signed. Without hesitation, he tore them up and let the pieces scatter in the wind. Some things couldn't be fixed, but others could be rebuilt from the ground up.
The Broken Arrow Ranch was no longer broken, and neither was Jake Martinez. He was finally home. In the end, there was only the water, and the song, and the endless possibility of consciousness, learning to know itself through every drop of rain, every flowing stream, and every sacred spring that had ever blessed the earth with its presence.